Support for the Brewlosophy podcast comes from the following. Love to Brew is the #1 choice for your homebrew holiday shopping. Award-winning beer recipe kits and beer making kits that both qualify for fast and free shipping. Perfect for the friend or family member who loves your beer but doesn't brew their own. Be sure to check out all Love to Brew has to offer at love2brew.com. The best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. Find everything from classics to modern favorites, as well as cool experimental varieties and a vast array of ingredients and gear at yakimavalleyhops.com. Welcome back to another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schatz, and joining me today is contributor Malcolm Frazer to revisit the topic of water chemistry. Only this time, instead of focusing on mash pH like we did a couple months ago, we're going to be getting into the minerals that matter in brewing.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on how I've been brewing since about 1997, but I think I've only started paying attention to minerals in general and water chemistry in general probably 2003, 2004-ish. So, almost 9 years or whatever, not even paying attention to water chemistry.
Well, I think a big part of that is that, water chemistry is one of those variables in brewing that, Jake and I talked about this before. It kind of got sold, or is even still today, kind of sold to, at least in the homebrewing world, to homebrewers as being the last thing that you should focus on, right? And here's a bag of pixie dust. Just sprinkle that in your wort and you'll be good to go.
Yeah, and of course there's the old adage of if the water tastes good, it's good for brewing. And while that may or may not be true, there's just more to it than that.
Absolutely. And, that's what inspired our series of experiments. I know that, in my thinking, the amount of minerals that you're typically adding into beer, and just to be clear, by minerals, we're referring to brewing salts. Some people call them salts. But the amount just didn't seem significant enough to me to really have an impact. So I went into this really looking to kind of confirm my own bias, and the findings have been interesting, and I look forward to kind of digging into the experiments that we've done in the past. But before we get into that, we've just got some announcements. Real quick, we are always in need of experiment participants. If you live in or around Chicago, Illinois, Denver, Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, Anchorage, Alaska, Atlanta, Georgia, and or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Malcolm, you'll be headed to Atlanta soon. Corona, California, or Fresno, California, and you want to lend your palate to brewing science, let us know, and we'll get you hooked up with the contributor nearest you. If you have a question for our Brew & A episode, you can email them to me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, or you can drop them on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or any of the other forums that we frequent online. The way that works, we're actually recording our next Brew & A episode. For the next episode that drops will be the Brew & A. And right now our plan is to release them every 10th episode. If you guys want more of them, let us know. We're getting a ton of questions, so if we don't get to it in one episode, it's probably going to be on the next one. So just let us know about that. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask. All right, a little bit of feedback. We didn't get anything specific in the last couple of weeks, but a lot of people have been asking about this idea that I brought up a couple months ago now called the Brew Club, which is basically an online brew club for fans of Brewlosophy, some of who might want to enter competitions with beers made using shorter and shoddier methods. I just wanted to kind of get it out there that I did register the club with the AHA, so it is official, and you can start entering your competitions under the Brew Club if you like. We are still trying to organize things a little bit there, so we'll be announcing when things get put together a little bit more. We're going to try to have a kind of online forum for people just to hang out and chat and kind of plan their shoddy brew days. So that is coming. Another piece of feedback, something that a lot of people have been asking about and I've failed to address on the show, is the music that we use in the podcast, particularly the song at the end of the show during our outro. Little background on that. I had a good friend in elementary named Mark Gadgetar. He was one of those is one of those musical geniuses. In 5th grade, he could just jam on a guitar, and his brother was a drummer, and he learned how to play the drums from his brother. Mark ended up joining a couple of bands. Most notably, he was in the Blood Brothers. For anybody who likes that kind of scream postmodern punk stuff, he was the drummer for that band. His brother also played drums for bands like Waxwing, Gatsby's American Dream, stuff like that. Well, Mark kind of peeled away when the Blood Brothers broke up. He started producing hip hop stuff. Some of it led to records with, partnerships that he did with other artists and whatnot. And then he had a bunch of leftovers. Well, that leftovers is what he gave me to use free of charge in the podcast. Pretty cool of him to do that. Mark and I don't talk much anymore these days. But I, knowing how talented he was, I sent him an email and asked him if he could send me some stuff, and he did. And I'm very grateful for that. So if you want to check out some more stuff that Mark has going, you can search for Gadja Magic. That's like his DJ name that he goes by. That's Gaja Magic, all one word, on Google or SoundCloud to hear some of his tunes. And I'm going to check with him to see if he's cool with me sharing that outro song, which is called Body High. So if you search it, you're not going to find it. But I'll see if I can't post it to the website and make it free to download for you guys. So Brew Your Own Magazine's only boot camp of 2018 is happening February 2nd and 3rd in San Diego, California. This is going to be an awesome and incredibly educational event with seminars taught by Michael Tonsmeyer, Gordon Strong, and the IPA master himself, Mitch Steele. That's right, he's returning from brewery planning himself to the city of San Diego to teach people about brewing and beer. Pretty rad. Get your tickets before December 15th to save $100 on registration fees. And make sure to write Brewlosophy in the notes at checkout to help support the show. If you're looking for a way to throw some support our way, head over to brewlosophy.com/support, where you'll find a list of links to use when you shop at places you're already shopping at. You won't feel a thing. We get a small kickback that helps to keep us bringing you these shows. If you want a little something in return for your support, check out our Patreon, where for as little as $1 a month, you'll be granted access to never before published Brewlosophy recipes, receive invites to monthly video chats, and you can even work with us to design your very own experiment. That's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Finally, please make sure to subscribe to the Brewlosophy podcast and leave a review wherever it is you listen to your podcasts. Not only does this give you an indication whenever we drop a new episode, but small things like that really do help us out. I know it feels like it's nothing, but it is something to us. So, okay, time for the 1-minute beer review. And on this one, I serve one of my favorite, local beers, sort of local, I guess. I live a couple hours from Firestone Walker. And, a few years ago, they made Pivo Pilsner, or Pivo Pils, and quickly rose to the top of my crushable beer list. And I drink it often. And I had some in my fridge, so I figured I would serve it to my buddies and see what they think.
1-minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
All right. It's Miller, Coors, or Bud Light.
No, it is not.
Tell me what it is, fucking garçon. I need you on this one because to me it's
not.
Miller, Butter, Coors
It doesn't
Light.
it does not have a smell,
Well, neither does Butter, Coors Light.
but it tastes awful.
No, it tastes like nothing. There's no flavor. It's Miller, Butter, Coors Light. We're being made to look like
Why am I
fools,
smelling
Tim.
the mic?
Tim, we're being made to look like fools. I see you shaking
No.
your head, Marshall. Brewlosophy com. No, I will not fall for this.
Second taste isn't bad, but there's no smell to it.
I'm going to go with MGD. It's MGD. Look in his eyes.
It's not even.
He's shaking his head, but I don't care. I don't care.
I'm not even looking at it.
Fine. It's Firestone Walker, super awesome brew for number 16 for the year. That's what it is.
It's not DBA or anything.
DBA is darker. This is a Bud
That's what I
Miller
said. It's not
Coors.
DBA.
You know what? Whoever made this beer and it's amazing and you think you did awesome work, it tastes like a Coors Light.
It does not take a. No.
It tastes like a Coors Light.
Not disagree.
Tell me why you disagree.
Because it's not Coors Light.
What describe that? You just keep
it
saying it's
continues
not.
after the taste doesn't just fall
Everything
off.
with you is like, does the taste continue or not? What does it taste like? If I put this in a Coors Light bottle or can, you think it was Coors Light.
No.
How about this? You can name this beer or I can name this beer. Whoever finishes their beer first names it. Go.
I could totally finish first.
Suck it!
Apparently not.
I name it Cares Light.
It is not.
With an A, the umlaut above the A. It's a Cares Light. I would drink it again.
It's not bad. I would continue drinking it.
So do I. Weird.
So they sort of started out not liking it, and it seemed like it evolved over time. And, it's funny because I've noticed in our the experiments that we do, when I serve people beer for evaluation, a lot of them, even if it's a beer they love, they kind of start off a little bit more critical of it than usual. But it was neat to see them kind of evolve throughout that, 1 or so minutes and into at least enjoying the beer enough to want another one. Malcolm, have you had Pivo before?
You kidding me? I love that beer. It's one of my all-time favorites. I go back and forth between my East Coast loyalties and Victory Premium Pils, but I love that hoppy Pilsner out in Firestone Walker. That's just an amazing beer.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And if I'm correct, or I believe Firestone Walker, they're dry hopping Pivo, and Victory's not dry hopping their Pilsner, or are they?
I don't actually know, but I know Pivo uses Saphir,
right?
And I think if they don't dry hop it, then they're doing a lot of late additions, but it's pretty aromatic, which I like. It's almost like it has the Pilsner roots, but it has like the little American twist on it, being that it's more aromatically fragrant. It's like floral, but also lemony. I love it.
I love it too. It's got that kind of pungent noble hop thing going on. So great beer. I'm glad the guys liked it. And just to satiate the curious, I ended up giving them more Pivo later on when we were done recording, and they enjoyed it just fine. So, all right. When we come back, Brewing Minerals is the name of the game. Stick with us. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste time chilling work, which is why I use cleverly designed immersion chillers from Jaded Brewing. After some bad experiences with counterflow and plate chillers, I began the search for a more efficient chilling solution and discovered Jaded. That was nearly 4 years ago, and to this day, I continue to rely on the King Cobra and the Hydra to chill my wort in record time without the setup or cleaning hassle of other chillers. If you're looking for a way to optimize your brew day, I can't recommend Jaded chillers enough. Go see what they have to offer at jadedbrewing.com and let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Founded in 1978 by brewing pioneer Charlie Papazian, the American Homebrewers Association is a division of the Brewers Association focused specifically on protecting and promoting the hobby of homebrewing. In addition to their work lobbying for the rights of homebrewers across the country, they're also the primary sponsor of Brewlosophy.com. By joining the AHA, not only are you supporting their cause, but you get a ton of benefits as well. Discounts at breweries across the U.S., early access to tickets for events like the Great American Beer Festival, and you get to attend HomebrewCon, the world's biggest gathering of homebrewers. Head over to brewlosophy.com/AHA now to sign up to become a member. Well, Malcolm, we know that water makes up the majority of beer.
Yeah, anywhere from, well, depending on the strength, right? But anywhere from like 90% down to 96 or so. But
pretty much anything that isn't alcohol or the remnant flavors from hops and hops and grains is water.
More or less, yeah. I mean, the other proteins and whatever minimal amount of lipids and esters and alcohols, that's almost minimal after ethanol. So
it makes sense that it would be important to mind our water.
Yeah, you would think that people would pay more attention to it early on, but it's a little bit intimidating, I think. So people tend to put it off towards they're comfortable with fermentation and comfortable with mashing and all the other processes, and then they tackle water eventually.
Right. And when it comes to water, brewing water in particular, there are two main focuses, right? One of them is pH, which is dealt with, I think the majority of it is dealt with using, acids of some sort, whether that's acid malt or lactic acid or whatever it is. And then there's the mineral makeup of the water. And that mineral makeup of the water, it consists of a certain, I'm sure, there's a ton of minerals that you're going to find in water, but there seems to be this set of about 5 that we focus on mostly as brewers.
Yeah, well, the calcium does have a minor effect on the pH too. We won't go into that here, but just know that it does.
Right.
It reacts with the phytins in the mash, and that has an impact on your pH. So basically what we do is we consider our water. So it means you have to know what your water is. You consider your minerals that you have in the water and its impact that it'll have on the pH. And then you can adjust the minerals for the flavor impact you want. So normally what we talk about is calcium, and that's for yeast health. To a minor degree, we talk about magnesium, and that's also yeast health, but it can have a mouthfeel impact as well. Sodium for its impact on flavor. And here are the big 2. Gypsum or sulfate.
Sulfate, yeah.
Yeah, and also chloride. So calcium chloride and calcium sulfate. Now, those 2 are what get a lot of the press because people will alter their amounts and their ratios with the hope of impacting their either hoppy crispness if you favor sulfates or the malty fullness if you favor chlorides.
Right. And traditionally that's been the Yeah, the kind of the purported impact that either of those have. That higher sulfate is going to produce that. You'll hear people say kind of a sharper or a more notable type of bitterness that's also tends to kind of pronounce the hoppiness of a beer, whereas chlorides, higher chloride levels are going to, kind of round out that malt character.
Yeah, and it's not as simple as that, but that's the general, catchphrase that people will just spout off. And,
right.
It's like if you get magnesium high enough, you're going to taste that or feel that in the mouthfeel too. And I think
and in your gut, I hear, because Epsom salt is used for and
it'll get things moving.
right. So Epsom is one of the main ways to get, and we should go into how to get these specific ions, how to get them in your beer. Epsom is magnesium sulfate, and so by adding that, you're upping your magnesium as well as your sulfate. And then the more popular way, as you mentioned, is to use gypsum, which is calcium sulfate.
All these things are salts, and a lot of them have a more, common name, and then they also have the salt name. So calcium sulfate or gypsum.
And so determining what you want, I think the most common thing back when I started brewing, it was 2003. So you're the OG of the group here, Malcolm, brewing since 97. But back when I started, the focus seemed always to be on the like historical, regional water profiles. So for example, I think that probably the most popular one, at least when I got started, was Burtonizing your water.
Yeah, miserable. I think chasing these specific profiles is madness, especially when you get into the Burton ranges. I'm sure it can be done, if you start playing around with all sorts of pressure and acids and everything else. But if you have relatively soft water, trying to get your profile up into 800 ppm sulfate is just this craziness to me. So I more or less just kind of stick to the spirit of a water in a beer. So if I'm doing, since you use that example, if I'm doing a English IPA or English Pale, there's no way I'm looking for 100 milligrams of magnesium and 800 ppm of sulfate, etc. I'll basically just take the ratios, and if you look at some of these software such as Brewing Water, I'll just go into it and I'll look up for a hoppy light colored beer, and I'll go with that.
I think there's a way, that's a good thing to focus on, right? Like there's a couple different perspectives to take when it comes to adjusting your water profile. One of them is, to kind of think of it, what I kind of consider like you're pulling really far back and saying, okay, for example, dry stout was developed in, Ireland, and Ireland is known for having this really hard water. And so, because they were doing it that way, it means that the right way to do it, or the best water for that style, is this hard water. So let's just copy, a Dublin water profile or something like that. Which to me, on a kind of a superficial level, that makes a lot of sense, and it works. I've done it before, and particularly for me, I've done it with a Dortmunder, and really, really hardened my water to make this Dortmunder export a while back. And I've done the same with dry Irish stout. So relying on these regional profiles isn't necessarily a bad thing, but like you said, I kind of view it these days as almost it's a little silly, because you're really working hard to create something that may not necessarily be required. I say that
to me, it's kind of like, well, they had this difficult water to work with, so they adjusted their brewing processes and beer styles to work with it. And we basically go, well, they had this handicap, let's give it to ourselves too.
Yeah.
So instead, what did that water provide? That water in the instance of Burton had a lot of sulfate, so it made their beers, dry and crisp and had like that snappy, hoppy bite. Well, perhaps we can achieve that with 100, 200, 300 ppm, of
right.
sulfate, and maybe like 50 ppm of chloride. So you don't have to go all the way there.
Right. Well, and that kind of leads to this other perspective, at least as I see it, to approach water manipulation, which is to kind of determine almost on a ratio level, what minerals you want and start with as clean a slate as you can. And a lot of people these days are relying on, RO or reverse osmosis water, or distilled water, something like that. And then building the water up from there. Maybe not go into the wacky extreme of Burton-on-Trent or Dublin, Ireland or anything like that, but definitely building the water up so that it has these different ratios of those minerals that are believed, at least, to have a specific impact on the type of beer that they're making.
Right. And that's exactly it. So once you start playing around with these programs, I mentioned Brewing Water earlier, he has these preloaded profiles you can go into, and, you can just kind of jot them down and then look what your water is, get a water sample from Ward Labs or you can start from ROs, certainly, and then build it close, get the ratios kind of close. You don't have to go all the way to the extremes of their mineral hardness and total numbers. But if you can get, within a few ppm, 10, 20, 30 ppm, and as long as your calcium's around 30, 40, most people say above 50, you're probably going to make a fine beer.
Yeah.
And then later on, you take the notes, you evaluate, you share it with your friends, and you say, you know what, I really would like it to be more of whatever, more snappy, more malty, adjust from there. But, do it once within reason. Don't make a seltzer water or mineral water.
Speaking of, I've actually, for fun, I mineralized. So my wife and I really like sparkling water. And so we've gotten into kegging water, and my water here at my house is good. And there's a reason I know that. And I'll get into that in a bit. But I started kegging water just straight out of a carbon filter at my house and carbonating it. And it was great. And then I saw that San Pellegrino lists their water profile, their mineral profile in their water. And so using my starting point of the tap water at my house, I built it up to match the San Pellegrino. Unfortunately, I didn't do a triangle test because we drank the water too fast. But it was really good. It was surprisingly good. And it did seem to change the character of the water. That could have been biased. But so yeah, this doesn't just apply to beer, I guess.
If you turn over a lot of waters that are mineralized, you look at, it's usually like magnesium sulfate and a little bit of chloride.
That was almost primarily what I used. Throwing a little bit of Epsom in my tap water with a dose of chloride, and it really added, to me, it kind of added that character that I really like in San Pellegrino. So, but like I said, there's ways that you can figure out your water profile. A couple that I would recommend. The easiest way, I think, is to contact your local water district. Usually they're really open about giving you those profiles. And in my experience, not only were they open about it, they're kind of shocked that I cared. And that led to the development of a pretty decent relationship with Bob over at the Fresno Water District here, and so he'll anytime I email him, he'll give me the updated mineral profiles for my house, and I've learned a lot about the water that comes to my house, so that's one easy way to do that. Well,
and it's definitely worth reaching out, and some of them are really helpful. So the place I lived before this, in eastern part of PA, they didn't have a lot of information to give me, but where I live now, they were pretty good. So you can ask, and you can actually talk to a rep, or not a rep, a service tech, and he or she can tell you. But sometimes you call them up, man, you get no information. So another option is perhaps like Ward Labs. And there's other proprietors out there, I guess, other providers, but Ward Labs is just ubiquitous. Everyone knows them. They're pretty inexpensive.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, Ward Labs is great. The two issues that I've found people run into, one of them is yours. That's just the information. For some reason, your local water district may not actually be gathering that information, which just seems a little odd, or maybe they're just not so open to sharing it. You will always be able to find certain things. And I think it's by federal law that they have to have it posted somewhere about like the stuff that could kill you, basically.
Yeah, all the things that are deleterious to health, they have to be listed, and they tell you if they're below the limit, etc.
Right. And so the other thing to do, and this is what I've done as well, just to double check, is send a sample into Ward Labs. And I want to spend a little bit of time going over the best way to do that for brewing, in my opinion, at least. But you send it in. What you do basically is you empty out a water bottle and make sure it's nice and clean, and you rinse it a few times. This is per the instructions from Ward. You rinse it a few times, and then you fill it up with the water that you're going to use for brewing. So what that means if you're going to filter your water through a carbon filter before you brew with it, filter your water and put that into the bottle that you send to Ward Labs. If you're going to be running RO water through a RO filter and you want to get it tested by Ward Labs, make sure you do that. If you just want to collect your water straight from the tap out of a garden hose, and that's what you want to brew with, I wouldn't recommend it, but that's what you plan to brew with. That's what you want to send to Ward Labs because you want to know your starting point. So that's the way to do it. When you talk to them, they're a farming company. I think they're based out of Nebraska or something like that. They're a farming company. So they're when you talk to them, if it's not about brewing, they'll tell you, send us your source water as it is, right? Because that's what's going to your crops basically. But that's not what we want to do. We want to send them the water that we're using for our brewing. The other issue that I've found is that with local water districts or people's local water at their house is just when it's super high in chemicals to sanitize, basically make it drinkable. And that's usually chlorine or chloramine. And those are, I'm not sure my Ward Labs printout ever included anything about like chloramine levels.
I know you can buy a chlorine testing kit at most hardware stores, and the third option would be, if you analyze your water with Brew Lab, some of those have a chlorine detection option as well.
Yeah. And so if the issue is that your water comes back with high chlorine or your water company is using chloramine to make the water drinkable, then there are some options for knocking that out so that you can use your tap water if you don't want to go and purchase water at a store every time you use it or buy an RO filter.
And as you mentioned earlier, you have to know where you're starting from. And the analogy I've used before is, if someone asks you for direction to the mall, you'd have to say, well, where are you starting? You don't just go, well, you head down this highway here or head south. You have to know where they're starting from. And if you're going to make any adjustments to your water, you have to know where you're starting from. So talking to your water authority, talking to Ward Labs, it lets you know where your baseline is and if you need to make any adjustments and what level of adjustments. Otherwise, you're just kind of flying blind.
So if somebody's water comes back from Ward Labs or their water district lets them know that they use chloramines, I think the easiest way, the most common way at least that homebrewers use to knock that chloramine out is to use Campton tablets, which is potassium metabisulfite.
Yeah. So essentially, there you just have a reaction, and your chlorine will turn into the chlorine portion of the water will turn into chlorides, and minimal amounts, trace amounts, and then the sulfite portion of the Camden tablets is converted to trace amounts of sulfate. So really, it's easy fix. It happens over a couple of minutes. Just add that to your brewing water, and you'll get rid of the chlorine or chloramine, which could potentially lead to an off-putting phenol, often called chlorophenol,
which is kind of Band-Aid plastic.
Medicinal, yeah.
Nobody wants that in their beer.
No.
Yeah. So I've never had to use, thankfully, I've never had to use Campton for that purpose. Yeah, I use it in my cider to knock the yeast out. But my understanding is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you add it, you want to decant off of, like if you have your water in a kettle and you add the Campton the night before you brew, the next day, do you want to decant that off because something will like precipitate out of the water, or is it cool just to use it straight up?
No, I just use it straight off. I mean, if you want to rack it, I guess you could and leave those, because you'll see some salts in the bottom, part of the reaction, whatever. I've never done that. I just add the Campton and grip it and rip it. I just don't really.
Awesome. No, I didn't know that. Yeah, like it's nice, the things that I don't have to deal with having the water that I do. And
our water here in Western PA, we use quite a bit of chloramines and chlorine, but I can tap it off of my filter and it smells like a swimming pool. On the back side of my filter, I have a 3-stage, one of those big blue 3-stage filters.
Oh yeah. On
the back side, nothing. And I've actually tested it for chlorine using one of those strips from the hardware store, and it's essentially zero.
Yeah. I've done the same. So I have a weird setup, and I think this is the case for a lot of people. And this is kind of another thing to consider is, if you send your water in to Ward Labs to get tested, and you live in an area where you are constantly pulling from different wells depending on their volumes, and if maybe at one part of the year you're getting groundwater or surface water, and another part of the year you're pulling from some well, you're not going to get consistent. You're not going to be able to consistently use that water profile that you get from Ward Labs, right? And that creates an issue because I had an experience late last year where they shut off our surface water treatment plant that comes to my house, which is 100% of the water that I get usually, but they turned it off for repairs or whatever, just updates, and without me knowing, and they flipped us over to a well, which usually services just houses like a mile and a half south of me. Well, I immediately knew a difference because my Star Sand water, within an hour of making it, would just turn milky white. And so I knew something was up. And of course, I emailed my friend at the water district, and he let me know for sure that, yeah, that's right. You're on different water now. So it's good to know that kind of stuff. So even if you are going to send your water into Ward Labs, highly recommend that you contact your water district so that you get a good idea of the source of your water if you're going to use home water. Obviously, the other option is to go buy your water or to buy an RO filter. And there are some decent priced RO filters that work really well. I think we saw one on Amazon. $75-$80 altogether, and using a TDS meter, I was able to get that hard water that I was on from upwards of 400 ppm of TDS, total dissolved solids, all the way down to 2. So it was working. It was doing its job. Carbon filters, people will say that carbon filters can actually knock out lower levels of chlorine. So that ought to work if you run the water through slow enough. You can't just blast water through a carbon filter. It's not gonna really filter anything out.
You can knock out some low levels of chloramines if you have a high grade pelletized carbon filter and you run it through real slow. But you'll still get some on the other side. That's why, if you do a filter and your municipality uses chloramines, then to use that security blanket of Campton tablets kind of helps out there.
And it's just so cheap. No reason not to.
And here's another thing too. If you're in an area that switches sources quite a bit, you can buy a relatively inexpensive TDS meter and kind of use it like a canary in a cave, right? So you get your baseline from your municipality, and you might need to do 3 different types of samples. You do one in the spring after the winter thaw, right? Maybe you do one in the midsummer, maybe you do one in the fall. So hey, around these times, the water switches due to your municipality switching the sources, right?
Right.
From groundwater to reservoir to well, whatever. Now, if you have a TDS meter, you pull your water, you check it. If it's within line, if your base is 120, 300 ppm TDS, all of a sudden you get a spike up or down, something's probably changed, and you can go check it then.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, with all of that said, I was one of those guys who in the beginning, kind of like I mentioned earlier, I kind of felt like the mineralization of the water that we were using to brewing just wasn't big enough to really impact the flavor. That was something that the malt that you used and the hops and the amount of hops that you used really determined. So, for example, I think IPA these days, and in particular New England style IPA, is getting a lot of attention. The water profile of those beers used to make those beers is getting a lot of attention lately. You got higher sulfate was kind of the traditional approach for IPA, and then you got the hazy New England style IPAs coming along, with the brewers of those beers bucking the high sulfate trend and advocating for really high chloride levels in relation to sulfate. And so I was curious about all of this, got into a conversation with another brewing buddy of mine who kind of challenged me. Well, hey, you're doing these experiments. Why not put it to the test and see if you can tell a difference? And so that's exactly what we did. And we focused on this variable quite a bit. We're going to get into it when we come back from this break. If, like me, you prefer the simpler side of brewing beer, you have got to check out the Brew Bag, a food-safe fabric filter that allows for mashing of the finest crushed grain without risking the dreaded stuck sparge. I've been recommending these things since I started using them. They are awesome. The Brew Bag offers the only completely reinforced fabric filter for brewing that can be used over 100 times and comes in sizes that fit most mash tuns, or you can even have one custom made. Go check the Brew Bag out at brewinabag.com and be sure to use promo code TBP17 to get 10% off your order of $30 or more. So back in late 2014, brewlosophy was just becoming its thing and all of this. I got into a conversation with a home brewer. His name's Dan Paris from inboundsbrewing.com. I'm not sure he's blogging too much these days. But we got into a conversation about water chemistry. And I made the very, you know what? I'll call it arrogant comment that water doesn't matter that much. And I kind of fed him the line that I'd heard so many times that water is the last thing we should focus on for a reason, because it doesn't make a big difference. And we were talking in particular about IPA. At this point, it was just your standard crisp, clear IPA. And he challenged me, fine, Mr. Experimenter, why don't you go and you do a test and see what the outcome is? Go into this thing from an objective place. And so I did. And that was the very first water chemistry experiment. We published it, I believe it was in May of 2015, something like that. Anyways, what I did with that one is I made a German Pilsner. It wasn't an IPA, but my thinking was I didn't want any of the hops to get in the way of the flavor or the impact that the variable would have on it. So I chose a German Pilsner, which is another beer sort of known for having a particular water profile, a little bit higher in sulfate than, say, something like a softer Bohemian Pilsner. And so with this experiment, I used just my filtered tap water at my house, which I mentioned earlier is very soft, almost like Czech water, Pilsen water. And so I brewed one German Pilsner using just that untreated filtered water. No additions were made whatsoever. And then the other one I treated with gypsum and calcium sulfate and magnesium sulfate or Epsom salt. So the other one I treated with gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, calcium chloride, and a little bit of magnesium sulfate or Epsom salt to get it to a specific kind of set level that was far different than the untreated water. So to go over those profiles real quick, the untreated water had 4 ppm of calcium, 1 ppm of magnesium, 10 ppm of sodium, 6 ppm of sulfate, 2 ppm of chloride, and the pH of that one was about 5.6 because I didn't adjust with acid in either of these. The treated water was at 145 ppm of calcium, 24 ppm of magnesium, 10 ppm of sodium. I didn't add any baking soda or table salt, which is where you'll usually get your sodium from. 302 ppm of sulfate, 99 ppm of chloride, and pH on that one was about 5.2. There was I brewed the beers. Everything was treated. They were treated exactly the same otherwise, except for the addition of these minerals to the mash. There was a tiny OG difference. I'm not really convinced that it had to do with the difference in minerals, but the treated batch, the batch that got all of the minerals added to it, came in at 1048 OG, and the untreated one was closer to 1049. To me, that's negligible. It was interesting to observe the fermentation differences in these beers. The untreated batch, so the one that didn't get any of the minerals, had a krausen that was kind of greener and stuck around a little bit longer than the treated batch. But otherwise, they fermented similarly and ended at the same FG. Nothing really surprising there. So when the beers were done, I carbonated them to the same level, made sure they were nice and clear and ready to serve to everybody. And I had 15 participants. And I was lucky enough in this one to actually get Colin Kaminsky, who is the co-author with John Palmer of The Water Book through the Brewers Publications. And one of the best books, I think, on water chemistry out there. It was really neat to have Colin offer to be involved in this experiment. I sent him some samples, and he and one of his co-workers when he was up at Downtown Joe's, still brewing there, participated in this one. In order, with 15 participants, in order for us to say that it was significant, we would have had to have 8 get the triangle test right. And in this case, 9 did. So we were able to say with some confidence that people could reliably tell these beers apart. And because of the fact they were treated so identically, we could say that was most likely due to the fact that the mineral profiles of each was different.
So these waters profiles were pretty starkly different, and funny enough, this is an unintended prelude to another experiment we'll talk about in a little bit about, mineral load, degree. So you had two things going on here. You had untreated, more or less brewing with your native water, and one which was, significantly more sulfate, 6 to 302 and 2 versus 99 ppm of chloride.
Right.
So, I mean, I think you would expect, if you're a water believer beforehand, you'd be like, oh, absolutely, this one's going to be, way, way easy to tell.
Yeah. And I'm not a water believer. So imagine, I'm sitting here going, oh man, I'm going to stick it to Dan. Like I'm going to show to him that it doesn't matter, and sure enough, when it came back, not only did it come back significant from the blind participants, I could so easily tell these beers apart in multiple blind triangle tests. And it was exactly what you would expect, right? The one with higher sulfate was just crisper and it had the kind of a cleaner, that what I expect from a German Pilsner. And the untreated batch was really good. It didn't taste bad by any means, but it was just rounder and softer on my palate. So it was, color me shocked when these results came back.
Yeah. What was going through your head when you were tasting these? You're like, oh man, I can tell.
Yeah. I mean, I think that happens to us a lot. It's one or the other. One, we're like convinced it's not going to have a difference and we're shocked when it does. But I think more often than not, we kind of think that there is going to be a difference and, or that there's not going to be a difference and we're shocked when there is. But yeah, going through my head, as I'm tasting these beers, oh my God, it matters. And you have to keep in mind that this experiment came after we'd done plenty of other ones that I was certain were going to have a huge difference, certain variables like fermentation temperature. And this thing that we're told to focus on last comes back significant. Had my head spinning a bit. And it certainly inspired future experiments. And you did the second one where you messed around with a darker style with mineral profile.
Yeah. So I ended up doing a dry Irish stout and I played with two common, we talked about this in one of the previous segments about common water profiles. If it's going to be a hoppy light beer, you tend to have like a 2 or 3 to 1 sulfate to chloride ratio. And then often if you want to accentuate chlorides, you'll either go the opposite or at the very least you go even, chloride to sulfate or sulfate to chloride, sorry.
And dry Irish stout, that's a style that it's known for having a higher kind of bicarbonate level. Harder water.
So if you're a fan of Martin Brungard's work, he'll talk about how the water actually came off the Wicklow Mountains into the Liffey River, and it was actually not that hard, which is why they did a mash to the side with the darker malts versus a mash with the base malt, and then they blended them later. So if you take that track of thinking, or if you do what a lot of people do, and if you look at a lot of books and a lot of websites, you're going to find that they claim the water for a dry Irish stout is somewhat carbonate,
Yeah.
And that would make sense because you're like, okay, that's why all that dark grain is in there to counteract the bicarb and, bring the pH down to a more standard level.
Right.
So, it kind of depends. I'm looking at a Dublin dry Irish stout water profile right now from a website I won't mention, but they have chlorides at 19 ppm, sulfate at 53 ppm, and bicarbonate at 280, which is 4 times higher than my native water.
And that's hard. That's a hard thing to adjust. So for your experiment, I think the crew was sort of interested to see what type of a difference, could I get away with using a hoppy pale ale profile with a dry Irish stout and still have it come out tasting, like a good dry Irish stout, or is that dark malty oriented profile actually going to produce a beer that tastes a little bit more like, Guinness or whatever it is?
Yeah, I think you called me out on this one because, I think the way we met was online, basically friendly banter, friendly argument. And so basically, because I was a water guy, you kind of said, well, maybe your first experiment should be water, challenge your own assumptions, So that's how this experiment came about. And then everyone always does pale ale. So I did an Irish beer, dry Irish stout beer. And I thought, of any beers that it should show, you know, it would either be a hoppy beer or a very dark beer.
Yeah.
When you start flipping the ratios, you know.
Yeah. And so you went with a hoppy. If you guys, if any listener wants to see what the profiles were, you can head over to brewlosophy.com and just search "messing with minerals." It'd take too long to go over every single mineral profile, but you went with a standard hoppy pale ale profile that you use for one batch. Same exact beer, the only difference being these different mineral profiles. And then in the other batch, you did a mineral profile that you would typically use in a darker, maltier beer, and you adjusted using acid to try to keep the pH the same between both, because at that time, at least, pH may have been had an impact.
We wanted to take that variable, or attempt to take that variable out of it.
Right.
So for the hoppy pale ale, without going over all the specifics, it was a 2.5 to 1 ratio of sulfite to chloride.
Okay.
And then for the dark malty water profile, it was 0.44. So, not almost flipped.
Right.
Almost flipped as far as the ratios.
So the beers were brewed, and then you took them to, I believe it was a club meeting or something like that, and you collected data from 29 different participants, which would require 14 people to get it right in order for us to say that there was a distinguishable difference.
Right. I ended up bringing it to a local brewery, which, they host me quite a bit, Grist House here in Pittsburgh. They're awesome. So 29 participants. I would have needed 14, but I got 18.
18 people. So 4 people more than statistically we needed to be able to say that the experiment was significant, which was our second finding, our second significant finding in regards to the mineralization of water. This was starting to seem meaningful to me. I'll be honest, man.
Well, I was a believer beforehand, so I was having my beliefs reinforced, so nothing makes you more happier.
You felt validated. That's
validated. Yeah, yeah.
What was your impressions of the beers when you tasted them side by side?
Yeah, they were starkly different, if I recall. I have my notes here, but yeah, the one with the pale ale profile, I remember thinking it was kind of oddly ashy. And the dark malty one just seemed fuller. So the pale ale one wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. It was more like ashy and harsh. Right. But the dark one, that was the biggest surprise, the dark malty profile. That beer seemed much more complex than I knew it was, because it was 3 ingredients. Okay, it's a standard dry Irish stout recipe with, I think I used Maris Otter, roasted barley, and flaked barley. Maris Otter, flaked barley, and roasted barley. So simple beer. But here I am drinking this beer and thinking like it tastes like there's chocolate and coffee. A flick of roast in here. I would have sworn there was a little bit of caramel. It was just it was a more complex beer than the other one. The other one tasted, the hoppy pale ale water profile beer, tasted kind of flat.
Yeah.
It had a flick of roast and that's it. It was kind of weird.
I know. John, our friend John Palmer, he did an experiment a couple years ago at the NHC, kind of similar to this one, with a stout, in different water profiles. And I've talked to him about it privately, and he had a kind of a similar experience. The one that was built to the dark malty type profile was just more complex and smoother and better. And I think that's so interesting when ultimately the amount of mineral that we're using, just it's not that much. Maybe an ounce and a half at max.
No, just a few grams or whatever, an ounce and a half of this small little pile of salts, and it makes the beer taste completely different.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Yeah. Well, and like you mentioned with that one, the ashiness coming through with that higher sulfate, that is something I'm really interested to explore just on my own kind of private level. Because when I think a lot of people stay away from dark beers because they hate that kind of acrid, ashy thing. And perhaps that has something to do with the water profile.
Yeah. I know I judge a lot of competition still. And one of the things you notice is how harsh some of the beers are, that the ones aren't scoring so well. And I'm not sure if it's people want to say it's extract or whatever. I often think it's probably extract plus, because that has all the minerals in it already from the maltster who made the extract. And then whatever minerals you have in your water, in a lot of places in the U.S., we have moderately hard water, so you're adding more minerals. I think it becomes this like salty, harsh mess.
Yeah.
And it really deadens the beer.
Again, just more reason to know what you're starting with,
Yeah.
Because if you don't, and you're just adding gypsum because somebody told you to add gypsum, you could be bumping that up into ashy territory if you're using it for a nice dark beer. The next experiment I did on minerals was one that was sort of inspired by a conversation I was having with a buddy of mine here in town. It seems like that's a common theme with this water chemistry stuff. He had made a beer. A local friend of mine had made a beer that he just thought was kind of falling flat and not that interesting. And I suggested, well, why don't you go and toss some gypsum in? He doesn't adjust his water. Why don't you go toss some gypsum in, see if that'll change things up a bit? And he was a little scared to do that, but it inspired this next experiment, which an adjustment to the beers post-fermentation. So basically what I did is I brewed up 2 Belgian pale ales, really simple. I think they were single hop with some New Zealand or Australian hop, 1054 OG. And fermented with that Antwerp ale yeast. It was a really simple beer. No mineral adjustments to the mash, nothing like that. So it's just a 10-gallon batch. And then once they were ready to keg into one, I added 1.1 grams of gypsum. I mean, that's nothing, by the way. 1.1 grams of calcium sulfate to achieve a sulfate to chloride ratio of 2-1. And what that ultimately ended up being was 106 ppm to 53 ppm, so about 2-1. With a calcium level of 93 ppm. For the other keg, I dropped in 1.9 grams of calcium chloride, and that one was to achieve a 1-1 sulfate to chloride ratio. I mean, this is nothing, right? 2-1, 1-1, not a big deal. That one resulted in 84 ppm of both calcium chloride and sulfate, or chloride to sulfate in the beer, and calcium at 83 ppm. So there was a slight difference there as well, 93 to 83. But otherwise, it was 2-1 versus 1-1. I was absolutely convinced this one was not going to come back significant. I served the beers to 21 different people, and which would require 11 to get it right to say it was significant. And lo and behold, 12 people got it right. Not only that, but I was able to distinguish these beers easily in every triangle test, or maybe not every single one, but in most of the triangle tests that I did. And it was exactly what you would expect. The 2-1 sulfate to chloride ratio was crisper. It was, I believe it almost was clearer even, which was interesting to me. It just had that kind of quick finish, that nice, clean, quick finish, which I tend to prefer in most of the beers that I drink. The 1-1 calcium to sulfate to chloride ratio beer was rounder. It had that flavor that kind of lingered a little bit longer. It left my mouth feeling a little bit, this sounds weird, but kind of wet after drinking it. I was really shocked, and this kind of said to me that if you screw something up water chemistry wise while you're making your beer and you want to adjust it later on down the road, you can. And I've heard of people actually adjusting in the glass just to test stuff out. So it was a really interesting experiment, and the one that the findings ended up kind of influencing the way I tend to think about sulfate to chloride ratios, which was the next one that we did. Jake Houlihan, a contributor, designed an experiment looking at the sulfate to chloride ratio and the difference that would have. Sort of a repeat of the post-fermentation adjustment one, though occurring during the mash.
Yeah, so this one, Jake, he ended up doing a IPA. He used Ray's Mac IPA from Love to Brew. Great recipe, by the way. And he was looking for either a high or a low sulfate to chloride ratio. So for one beer, he ended up going 150 to 50, or a 3-1 ratio of sulfate to chloride. And the other one was 0.3, 50 to 150? It should be the opposite, right? Yeah, 0.33. So basically flipped. So this is almost what I did with the dry Irish stout, but now he's doing it for an IPA.
Right. And no adjustment to the pH or anything like that.
No, he ended up with different pHs, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, standard brew day, nothing seemed to be, out of the norm as far as appearance, and I think the performance of the mash and everything was pretty much down the line. And then he ended up serving it to 22 people, and he would have had to have 12 people to accurately select the unique beer, and he ended up getting 14 people.
Just more evidence that minerals matter. And this was really starting to I think it was at this point where I started thinking to myself, maybe water shouldn't be the last thing we focus on as brewers. I don't know. When I'm producing award winning, I will say award winning because I've scored very well and won awards with warm fermented lagers, and those are turning out well. Meanwhile, these tiny little adjustments that we make to our brewing water are producing differences between beers.
Right. And at least on the mineral adjustment side, it seems pretty overwhelming evidence,
So the last experiment that we've done so far, at least on brewing water minerals, was one that Jake Houlihan did again on mineral load. And this is an interesting concept, one that's been talked about. I know John Palmer's talked about it before. This idea that the ratio is what matters and not the actual amount of the minerals. Correct me if I'm wrong, Malcolm, but this idea that if you have, let's say the ratio that you're aiming for an IPA is 2-to-1 sulfate to chloride. You could have 100 ppm sulfate to 50 ppm chloride, or you could have 300 ppm sulfate to 100 ppm chloride, and those
math is hard.
Yeah, I know. Did I get that wrong? I probably got it wrong.
No, I think you got it right.
Okay,
but
good.
Math is hard. I could hear your brain.
I've been
thinking.
out of school for a while, so but that those would ostensibly create the same or have the same impact on flavor because the ratio is what matters. It's something that I was fascinated by and that Jake ended up putting to the test. And so what he did is he designed an English bitter that I asked him to go a little bit heavier on the OG on this one, just so that it wasn't too low. I think he went 1052. Yeah, 1052 OG English bitter. Pretty simple bitter recipe, no big deal there. One of them he built up to a what we called the high load condition, which had a chloride to sulfate ratio of 0.5 or 150. This one was a 200 to 100.
Yeah, he flipped it. We often people talk, sulfate to chloride. He flipped it to chloride to sulfate.
Yeah. So, but 200 ppm sulfate to 100 ppm chloride. That was the high load condition. This one also had, I think it should be noted, 138 ppm of calcium, and that when you're adding that much mineral, both of which come along with calcium, you're going to bump up your calcium levels as well. The low load condition had 51 ppm of sulfate and 27 ppm of chloride. So they both were at the ratio was 0.5 for the high load and 0.53 for the low load condition. So that was the goal, to have the sulfate to chloride ratio be the same, but for them to be drastically different actual amounts. Yeah,
see, I never really adhered to the whole ratio only. I think the extremes matter too, so yes, the ratio matters, but within a set band. So I found this one an interesting experiment. I wanted to see how this was going to unfold.
Well, and I was super interested to see how these would unfold as well. And I think it makes logical sense that the more of something you have in a beer or in any edible, the more impact it's going to have on the flavor. And so I was pretty convinced that this was going to be, especially with the all of the significant results that we'd been producing, I was pretty sure that this was going to be significant. But surprisingly, it was not. Out of the 22 participants that participated, only 8 got it right, and we would have needed 12 to say that it was significant. So what that says is that these beers were similar enough that a significant number of tasters just couldn't tell it apart. And I was talking to Jake about his experience tasting these beers, and he had the same thing. He was just shocked that how similar they tasted, despite this massive difference in actual amount of minerals that was used to make the beer and to bring them to those different ratios. Pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and my guess would be, and this is of course me defending what I want to believe, but my guess, I'm fine admitting that. My guess would be there's a point at which it starts to diverge. So who knows what that is? Is it 300 to 150? Is it 400 to 200? At some point, I think there's going to be a divergence because, like you said, you're just putting so much stuff in there. You know?
Well, idea for future experiment. You dose a beer all the way to its saturation point for sulfate and chloride. Dose the water, and then that's when you would decant off of that and use that for your mash water. I'm with you. It seems to me like when it comes to that ratio and mineral load, that at some point it's going to have an impact. But surprisingly, in this one, it didn't seem to support that idea. And in fact, people weren't able to tell those beers apart. Pretty surprising.
Yeah. Well, sometimes evidence, it's like a beautiful theory smashed to death by facts, or data in this case. Not
yeah,
facts,
right.
data.
Yeah. People don't like when we call these facts, and I agree. So that's a bunch of experiments that we've done, all of them with the exception of the last, seeming to support this idea that minerals do make a difference and they have an impact on the flavor of your beer. From that, where do you stand? I mean, what's your, if somebody comes up to you and asks, hey, Malcolm, what do I do with my water? I want to make a good, fill in the blank type of beer.
Well, I think the most obvious question is, at least to my mindset, is do you like your beer? Because if you do, then do nothing to your water. If you have no interest in delving into chemistry, then do nothing to your water. Who cares? But now there could be two reasons to do it. One, you just want to learn about water chemistry and brewing water chemistry, and that's fun to you. So then, I would say do a water sample, find out where you are, download Brewing Water, mess around with it. He has a great water knowledge right up in the bottom of his Excel spreadsheet.
It's fantastic. Yeah,
it's real. It's like a real short primer on what to do and what each thing that you do, how it impacts potentially the beer.
Mm-hmm.
So go through that for the sake of learning, and the other reason to do it might be for the sake of improving your beer. So say you have a good pale ale, but you really notice you lack that crisp dry finish that makes you want to drink the next sip before you even put your glass down. So if you're seeking that and you don't have that, then obviously perhaps one of the ways to achieve that is through water chemistry, So it really comes down to your goal, to do it for the sake of it. A lot of people won't do that because there is some learning involved. But
yeah, well, one of the things we didn't really focus much on when we were discussing the experiment results was the taster preferences, and I think that's if you go back and you look at all of those experiments, which you can do over at brewlosophy.com. Surprisingly, the taster preferences were almost always split right about down the middle, which means that there's no one right way to do things. And don't let anybody try to convince you that there is. Maybe you want that dry stout that has a little bit of that ashy characteristic. Maybe you want your IPA to have a soft mouthfeel with a round malt character. New England IPA wouldn't exist, I don't think, if it weren't for people thinking outside the box and having different preferences. So, make the advice that I would give is experiment until you find what it is that you want and that you like, and stick with that. The final thing that I want to touch on a little bit, at least, is this idea that water should be the last topic of focus in your brewing. I can sort of understand why people might say that and why it became kind of, but I disagree with it. It should be something that you are aware of. In particular, if you're brewing with water that comes out of the tap at your house, and you're making homebrew that tastes like medicine, that's a problem. Be aware that it's not always just a contamination, that it could be something as simple as water. And the easiest test, go buy some spring water or go buy some RO water and toss in some brewing salts. See if that changes the character of your beer.
Yeah, and the other thing is, we were kind of talking in the group about how have these experiments impacted how we brew currently, as far as the contributors go.
So what say you, Malcolm?
So for me, for the most part, because I was a water advocate beforehand, I would say I've loosened up a little bit because of some of the other experiments we've done. And now I'm more about hitting a range. And we talked about, instead of brewing to a particular water profile, now I brew to kind of the essence or the spirit of that water profile and that beer's character. So, if I'm within 20, 30, 50 ppm, depending on the range, I just call it fine. If I'm within a few tenths of a pH, I call it fine. And then I know at the back end, I can adjust along the way. So I can either sit there and go, okay, my finished beer is not as dry as I want. I can add some gypsum in the keg. Or even during the boil, if I see I'm not getting that protein coagulation, I know I can add a few drops of acid, drop the pH, and hit that isoelectric point to get that great coagulation. There's places along the brew process that you can adjust. And
right. It's funny because I feel like I'm kind of in a similar spot as you are now, and that we've kind of converged. But for me, that has been not loosening, but kind of tightening my perspective on water. I mean, there's not a beer that I make these days where I don't adjust the water profile. And in particular, given the results of pH, like we discussed in the past, it does seem to me, I mean, at least on the home brewing scale, and I can't speak for professional brewers at this point, but it seems to me that adjusting mash pH should matter. But we've taken it to its extreme and the beers are coming out pretty much fine. And it's not like we're losing efficiency or anything like that. So I'm not really sure what to think about that. I would say that I've loosened my grip, on my demands for hitting the right pH. Though I don't seem to struggle too much with that anyways, but man, I am a nut when it comes to the mineralization of my brewing water. And I feel like, for me, it's made my beer better. And I guess that's what matters the most. Yeah.
And kind of the concept I've come up with is brewing and beer. So beer is a robust product and brewing is a robust process. So if I'm a couple tenths out or a couple ppm out, I basically just make a note of it. I taste the beer when it's finished, and then I see if it mattered, and then I go back to the last time I brewed it and make an adjustment. Because sometimes you end up throwing in a different ingredient, so say you don't brew with wheat very often, and all of a sudden you throw wheat into your process, and you're like, oh, that impacted my pH more than I thought it was going to. Do I sit there and panic? No. I just go, carry on, brew the beer, taste it, make an adjustment if needed. That's it.
Yeah. Amen, man. Well, if you guys want to learn more about brewing water and the experiments we've done on that variable, you can head over to brewlosophy.com and search it there. If you enjoy what we're doing and you want to help us bring you more, head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can help us out. And don't forget to check out the rewards you can get for supporting us at patreon.com/brewlosophy. If you have any questions you want answered on a future Brew & A episode, you can email them to me, Marshall, at brewlosophy.com, or if you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, you can ask there too. If you'd be so kind as to subscribe to this podcast and leave a review, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back soon with the next episode of the Brewlosophy Podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.